Hello and welcome to part 4 of making Navia from Genshin Impact. In this video I'll be making the bodice and the hip sash, and I'll be showing you the whole process of how I made it. The bodice has some crazy details. In the video we're going to go over boning channels, 3D printing, as well as some painting and extensive amounts of hand sewing. And thankfully there's a pattern to guide us through making it. Now let's get into making the bodice. To start off, I traced all the Navia bodice pattern pieces, foam patterns, and as well as the sash pattern pieces. I also printed out a corset pattern that I had planned on using to provide structure underneath. I didn't use this because of time constraints. For the gold centre front trim, I cut out 2 curved strips of 2mm thickness EVA foam, then flipped each piece to be glued down on the wrong side of the gold faux leather. After the glue dried, I trimmed the gold leather to about 6 to 7 mils from the EVA foam. To glue the fabric onto the back of the EVA foam, I first had to prepare the seam allowance before folding the fabric over and gluing the fabric onto the foam. For the concave edges, I snipped into the fabric, and for the convex edges, I cut small V's into the fabric. For the corners, I trimmed diagonally, leaving about 1 to 2 mils of fabric between the edge of the EVA foam and the cut line of the fabric. So when folded, the edges would turn into a corner. I then painted glue on the EVA foam and stuck all the pieces down that we have just trimmed. I further trimmed the edges and folded the fabric onto the glue. I found out the glue wasn't strong enough to bond the fabric, so I had to use clamps to hold the fabric down whilst the glue was drying. Once the piece had dried, this piece didn't turn out well because of the indents from the clips. So I made these pieces a second time, but this time I used heavy books to press down and hold the fabric and glue in place instead of clips. I began making the bodice by starting with the centre front of the bodice, which was the white centre. This piece required 3 layers of fabric. The first layer, closest to the body, is a thick cotton. The second layer, the middle layer, is a white satin, and the third outermost layer was pleated white chiffon fabric. To make the front, I first cut out a massive rectangle of chiffon fabric, then hand pleated and pinned the pleats and hand basted all the chiffon pleats in place. I used a different colour thread to hand sew and secure a strong cotton fabric as the third layer onto the chiffon and satin layers. After this, I carefully sewed all 3 layers together and left the top edge as the opening to flip right sides out. I clipped the edges and unpicked all the hand-basted seams and flipped right sides out. I stretched this piece of fabric by pinning it to my ironing board. I then lightly ironed the opening edge, then carefully hand sewed the top opening closed without hand sewing it to the ironing board. To make the roses, I cut a 85cm by 10cm strip of chiffon fabric. Fold the corner piece onto the fabric, sew it down. Using a wide stitch, fold the edge again so the edges are aligned and sew all the way to the end. Trim the triangle excess flappy piece. Gather the fabric by pulling the thread from each end to your desired effect. Fold the fabric tightly over the starting end to form a spiral. Make sure you have the flower base with your hand. Once you've reached the end, then hand sew through and around the end of the flower to secure the end. Cut the messy edge with your scissors, then hand sew around and around on the base of the chiffon rose, then tie a knot and snip the thread. Now that you've made 1 flower, do this 2 more times so you have 3 flowers. For the black front piece, I cut out 2 pieces of fabric on the fold from the same black velvet upholstery fabric I used for Navia's skirt layer. As the gap between the pattern and the fold was so narrow, I used my heat erasable pen to trace around the pattern piece onto the fabric. After unpinning part of the pattern, I moved pins to help anchor the fabric piece so it wouldn't get in the way of my scissors, and I was then able to cut out the excess fabric from the fold. For the interfacing, I cut 1 piece out. As the interfacing was a lot thinner than the velvet and a lot more easier to handle, I was able to cut out the excess fabric at the fold with a lot more ease. I then ironed the interfacing onto the wrong side of the black velvet fabric and used a pressing cloth, which was my bodice mock-up. I pinned the 2 layers right sides together, then sewed using a 1 cm seam allowance. I left a gap at the bottom edge so I'd be able to pull the fabric right sides out later. I trimmed along the entire edge and clipped along all the curves. I then flipped this right sides out, ironed flat off camera, then hand stitched the opening closed. The second piece for the bodice is now complete. This piece was a lot more challenging than the black velvet piece. I cut out 2 pieces of fabric. As you can see, when placing the pattern on the fold, the seam allowances at the bust area would actually go well and truly over the fold line. I actually had to modify the pattern, take out the seam allowance from the pattern so this would work. Then when cutting out the fabric, I traced this section of fabric where my seam should go. After cutting through the fold at the bust, I flipped the pattern and traced where my seam should go on the other side. I did the same method for cutting out the interfacing. I then ironed the interfacing on while off camera. I had to draw the seam again as the iron erased my heat erasable pen markings. I placed the pieces right sides together, then sewed the interfacing and non-interfaced fabric right sides together and left a small opening along the straight edge. I used my pinking shears to trim the fabric edges down and to prevent fray. I trimmed the corners and clipped along all the curved edges, then pulled the fabric right sides out. I also ironed the piece of fabric flat and then hand sewed the opening closed. The third piece of the bodice is now finished. For the gold side piece, I used my cry cut to cut out this bodice piece. My cry cut actually struggled cutting out the faux leather. It took multiple attempts. I managed to make it work by using the heavy duty cry cut mat and thoroughly rolling the fabric flat onto the mat. I cut 4 pieces. I also used the cry cut to cut out all the decorative details. As the cry cut cutting blade wasn't the most suited for cutting out faux leather, the cry cut didn't fully cut all the way through the fabric. However, it did fully cut through the bigger pieces. I used a craft knife and scissors to fully cut through the pieces. After carefully separating each piece, I placed the decorative details onto the solid fabric piece and layer them out to be the same placement according to Navia's bodice. Once I was happy with the placement of the decorative pieces, I used fabric glue to secure each piece to the solid base fabric. I also pressed down on each piece to help the decorative pieces stick to the fabric. I finished securing the pieces with the glue. I top stitched each and every piece of fabric down. This took a lot of time, going slowly with majority of the stitches and even hand wheeling the machine. I also tied knots at the back of the fabric to further secure the thread. I didn't record this, however I sewed the fabric pieces right sides together with a narrow seam allowance. I clipped along the curves and I left a gap to turn the fabric right sides out. I inserted a 2mm EVA foam piece into the bodice piece, then hand sewed the opening closed. For assembling the bodice together, I started by pinning the black velvet piece and navy piece together. I hand sewed 2 rows of basting stitches to secure each piece together. I sewed the 2 pieces using my sewing machine, then did a second stitch to make it look similar to Navia. I then unpicked all the hand basted stitches out of the bodice. My sewing machine skipped a few stitches, so I hand stitched this spot down. When I was attaching the gold piece to the bodice, I wanted to display all the top stitching, so I actually hand sewed the edge of the gold piece to the edge of the navy fabric. Here is what the stitches look like up close. For the white center, I hand sewed the gold foam pieces down onto the white fabric. I hand sewed this through multiple layers for it to be secure, and I sewed through the back of the gold pieces to hide the stitches. Fun fact, for majority of this project, I actually tried to avoid using fabric glue. I hand stitched the white center to the velvet part of the bodice. I then hand sewed the chiffon flowers onto the front. This navy triangle piece will be going right next to the gold panel piece. I cut out the interfacing from a scrap piece of fabric, and then cut out 4 pieces from the navy fabric. I then ironed the interfacing on 2 of the fabric pieces. For the back panel and side panel that has all the black crisscross details, I cut out some skin coloured lycra. For the side piece and the black detail on the back, I cut out these pieces out of black mesh fabric. To achieve the crisscross detail, I first copied the crisscross pattern onto tracing paper. I pinned, then zigzag stitched the elastic onto the black mesh fabric to replicate the placement of the same crisscross effect as shown on Navia's bodice. The crisscross patterns on each side of the mesh were not identical to each other, that being the crisscross elastic mirrored each other instead of being identical, so the elastic had to be placed differently for each. I machine sewed the elastic in place using a zigzag stitch. I pinned then sewed the 2 back mesh pieces together. I clipped the corners and trimmed the fabric and flipped it right sides out and ironed flat. I then sewed the back mesh piece onto the skin coloured fabric for the back. After sewing the mesh onto the skin coloured fabric, I then sewed the 2 skin coloured back pieces right sides together and with the mesh being on the right side. I left a small opening on the back piece so I could easily flip it right sides out. I then trimmed and clipped the curves. For the back navy panel, I cut out 2 pieces of interfacing and 4 pieces of navy satin. I pinned the non-interfaced to the interfaced pieces right sides together and now have 2 bodice pieces, that being a left back piece and a right back piece. For all the decorative pieces, I used my crafter's knife to cut each piece from 3mm EVA foam. This turned out to be a lot of pieces in total. To make each piece gold, I traced over each piece onto the gold faux leather. I used double-sided tape to cover the entire area where I traced all the foam pieces. I then pressed the tape down onto the fabric to further secure it and began peeling off the red cover of the tape. I used my weeding tool and tweezers to remove the tape cover. I began placing all the foam pieces down onto the tape. I stuck all the matching pairs down with each piece mirroring each other. This would mean that each piece could go on either the left and right side of the bodice back. I separated each piece, then carefully clipped and trimmed around the concave and convex curves. I used my weeding tool to fold the sticky fabric onto the foam pieces. I then did the same process for these pieces, which would sit at the upper back of the bodice. And here is what the finished pieces look like. I also did this piece too. I found this shape to be the most challenging out of all the pieces, and this was mainly due to how small this piece is. I first stuck a pin to mark the centre, then used my weeder tool to poke a hole. I used my scissors to snip the fabric within the hole of the foam. I then folded the inner fabric pieces onto the foam. Then folded the sticky fabric onto the foam and trimmed the excess fabric where needed. I found the bigger foam pieces a lot easier to do compared to the smaller foam pieces. I trimmed away the excess sticky fabric, snipped along the inner curves, then snipped small V shapes from the outer curves. Then I folded each piece down onto the foam, so when flipped it would look like this. After folding the fabric down onto the foam, I found that the tape wouldn't stay stuck permanently and would slowly fall away with time. So, to overcome this problem, I hand sewed each piece of faux leather down. I started off by pressing all the pieces down onto the back, so it would stay stuck for the meantime. I then hand sewed through the gold fabric pieces and alternated from left to right side as I was making my way through hand sewing each piece down. At some points it was difficult to push the needle through the fabric and the sticky layer, so I used a thimble which helped push the needle through. For smaller edges like the pointy edge, I did more stitches to secure the fabric wrapping. After hand sewing all the fabric wrappings down, I finished off the thread and tied a knot. The hand sewing is complete and the gold wrapping is now secured. I did the same process with the larger pieces by firstly folding the sticky fabric down onto the foam. I hand sewed from the pointy ends first, then secured the thread by tying a knot when I ran out of thread. I also secured fabric on the wider edge too, by using a wide stitch as I alternated from each side to secure it down. After a long time, I had finally finished hand sewing and securing every piece. These were all the back and side pieces for the bodice. I sewed the interface pieces and skin coloured lycra pieces together and sewed all the non-interface satin and mesh pieces together to the non-interface pieces. I sewed the crisscross mesh pieces by sewing each navy piece to the mesh piece first and stopping at the Y seam. I then sewed the two navy pieces right sides together and pulling aside the corner edge of the mesh piece so that it is out of the way of sewing. The next step is to sew a zipper in the bodice. I pinned then hand stitched the zipper to secure it onto the fabric. I then used my machine to sew on the zipper. As the zip is an open end zip, I sewed one side right sides together, then sewed the fabric on the other side of the zip together. For the seam at the zip, I sewed this folded, so the closing would be easy to do when flipped right sides out. I'll explain this in more detail later. I then sewed all the way around the bodice right sides out. In hindsight, I wouldn't do this, and I'll explain why when I show you. Anyway, in this clip, I sewed the interface and non-interface pieces right sides together for the entire bodice. I sewed the centre back together. I slowly sewed it together and carefully readjusted my sewing foot as much as needed. For the triangle piece, I made sure I pulled the pointy edge out of the way to include sewing the edge of the triangle piece in place. I had my pins purposefully placed to match the interface layer seams with the non-interfaced fabric seams. I finished sewing the seam at the zip opening. I snipped the seam allowance for the curved edges for the pieces, then trimmed the seam allowance with pinking shears, and then trimmed the curves for the bodice edges. I also trimmed and clipped the mesh and lycra fabric pieces to reduce bulk. I believe I sewed the triangle incorrectly on this side of the bodice, so I unpicked, then tied off the seam and hand sewed it closed. I used tweezers to remove all the pieces of the tracing paper that I initially used for stabilizing the mesh fabric. I flipped this right sides out. This is the part that we talked about sewing the fabric on the fold. Now that it's flipped right sides out and the fold is sewed in place, it is now really easy to have a neat finish. All that needs to be done is press the seam allowance and hand sew closed, and we will have a clean and finished seam. So this is the other part with what I mean about sewing the left and right side of the bodice separately. See how the centre back channel would be too narrow to pull right sides out? So to combat this, I unpicked the seam. I hand sewed a stitch to close the centre back, then tucked the seams within the bodice layers on each side and hand sewed these closed. Flipped each piece right sides out from it, then hand sewed these pieces together. The navy centre back is now connected. I sewed the boning channels around the mesh pieces for stability. I had a lot of difficulty cutting the spiral steel boning. I tried doing the snipping, the spiral edge technique, but it just would not work. I actually had to use the angle grinder to cut it. I capped the edges of the spiral steel boning to stop the boning edge cutting the fabric, then inserted the boning through the channels. Then I hand sewed the channel openings closed. I attached the skin coloured part of the bodice back by hand sewing it to the other back piece. I started off by placing all the pieces onto the bodice to match the back of Navia's bodice. I hand sewed all back pieces on individually by hand. This part alone took about 14 hours a day for about 2 days to completely sew each piece securely onto the bodice. I hand sewed a navy stitch around the entire edge of every piece individually to anchor it to the bodice. I anchored each piece by sewing through the gold leather, then stitching through the navy satin of the bodice. If the gold leather was too thin, I had to sew through some of the EVA foam instead. This task of sewing all these gold pieces on overall required sewing through thick and difficult to pierce through fabrics, pushing the needle through at awkward angles. I had sore fingers and the needles would pierce through my fingers and make them bleed from trying to push the needle through the thick materials. Depending on the size and complexity of each piece, the duration of properly securing one piece on could be anywhere between 30 minutes to a few hours. The back of the bodice was now finally complete. I made some bodice panel inserts too. I actually thought the bodice was going to be too small for me, however it turned out to fit fine without the inserts. I tried on the bodice and it was slowly but surely coming along together. It was now time to add all the extra details on. I used my cracker to cut out gold heat transfer vinyl. I weeded out the design, then ironed the vinyl onto the front of the bodice. For all the decorative details, I 3D printed them, then once they were finished, I removed all the support structures. I sanded and prepped all the pieces by layering a few coats of acetone and wood filler mixed together. I painted a layer of the mixture on the prints, then let them dry, then repeated this again. I did this until the layers were thick enough and the prints ended up looking like this. I further sanded the prints to make them smooth, then I weeded out the built-up mixture sitting within the detail engravings. I brushed away any excess dust from sanding the pieces, then repeated the process of sanding and brushing until I was happy with how the pieces looked. After prepping the pieces, it was then time to prime the pieces before painting. I sprayed a layer of paint primer onto the prints and then let the prints dry. I superglued snap-on clips onto the backing of the 3D prints so that they can snap onto the bodice when I sew the clips on later. For the sash wheels, I used acrylic paint to paint in navy blue in the area as shown. For all the bodice pieces, I used black acrylic paint to all the grooves for detailing. I also painted the center of the wheels in black too. The front and back of the bodice was now completely finished. Now that we've finished the bodice, it was time to make the sash. I cut out all the sash pieces out and sewed the pieces right sides together. I trimmed the edges and clipped the curves, then turned these pieces right sides out. The side hip pieces were straightforward and easy to make. However, the front sash piece was where it got really challenging. What helped me get my head around this was flipping one piece right sides out, then pinned one of the other sash pieces to one side right sides together. Then sewed these pieces down, then pinned the other piece mirrored onto the other side with right sides together, like how I did it here. Sewing all these pieces became very thick for my machine to sew through, which caused skip stitches, so I hand sewed these gaps closed. After sewing and flipping right sides out, the sash should look like this. As we cut out 4 of these pieces, and we've just sewed 2 of these down, get the other 2 pieces that I sewed along the curve off camera and pin this right sides together to these pieces. I tucked the other sash piece within the sash pieces I was pinning, so that I could pin all the way around the fabric edge. With this pinned, sew it together and flip it right sides out. I had to push this later down into the sash pouch to make it look like a sash. I deviated from the pattern in this step, but for all the openings on the sash pieces, I actually hand stitched the openings closed. I also hand sewed the pleats in place for each piece, then I hand sewed the front sash piece to the side hip sash pieces. For the final part, I hand sewed large clips onto the sash to attach the hip wheels. For the plate that sits on the front of the bodice, I sewed multiple small clips to hold the plate in place. I sewed clips to attach the center back pieces too. For all the pointy arrow prints on the front of the bodice, I hand sewed 2 clips for each piece so the pieces would be secured and would not move around if bumped. I attached the sash onto the bodice by hand sewing clips onto the left and right side of the bodice, as well as hand sewing clips to attach the end pieces of the sash on the back of the bodice, with the end of the sash being hidden by the skirt back bow component I made in the part 3 video. And with that, the entire bodice and sash for Navia was now complete. The bodice for Navia is now completely finished. I'm really happy that I finished this. It was quite a challenging component of this project. This was my first time ever making a corset bodice, as well as my first ever time using boning. This is probably the most complex piece of garment that I've ever made. It definitely took a lot of time to make this. Not only the hand sewing of the gold pieces, but also the hand sewing of the gold pieces onto the bodice. There was also a bit of guesswork with the fit. I'm not the same size as the pattern provided, however I did adjust the seam allowance and that seemed to work for me to make the bodice fit my body. To be honest, it was a big jump outside of my sewing comfort zone and I'm so happy I was able to not only try it but also finish it. And I'm so happy that I was actually able to make this and it somehow worked. Well, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and I will see you in the next one.
A proper send-up!